Thank you so much, folks. Thank you, Ryan, for inviting me. I think this is a wonderful thing that you have here, and I would like to come to more of these, so I'm really honored to be here. So I want to talk about some of the most powerful people in our society, that is, our employers. And in my view, I think there's too little discussion about about this group and the ways which they have a lot of control of our lives. Of course, we know that they hire and fire, they set pay rates, they decide what, if any, benefits we receive. They often are pretty much dictators in our workplaces. They're dictators for a good part of our lives. They want control, and they generally, as we know, hate unions, and have been pretty successful in most cases in preventing their spread. And we know this is true in the wake of the Nissan union organizing defeat in Mississippi. And so building unions, needless to say, I think this group will know is hard work. And I don't need to convince this group that unions have done much good. They help democratize the workplace to a certain extent. They give, of course, they're responsible for improving wages and spelling out benefits. They make capitalism, I think, more palatable. And, but of course, it's very difficult. We don't face, say, the same kind of resistance if we want to join, say, a civil rights group like the NAACP, or a group that promotes women's rights like NOW. And union busting, that is the attempt to undermine the growth of unions, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It involves consultants, lawyers, psychologists. Some union busting lawyers I read recently make between $700 and $1,000 an hour. Big business. But we don't learn too much about this history from, say, the mainstream media or, say, textbooks, history textbooks. What I think we get a lot of passive voice, right? Wages were low. Conditions were bad, right? Why don't we hear something like, in an effort to maximize profits, such and such CEO cut wages and fired thousands of employees, right? We don't hear that, right? We hear something more palatable. It's the market, these sort of forces that are not, we can't pinpoint, right? And so of course, employers, they don't like unions, and somehow, the sources of information in our society have prevented really honest discussions about their role in preventing unions. And so another message I think we get is that, it's not employers who are necessarily anti-union, it's Americans. Americans are individualistic, right? That they want unions, and Americans have a can-do attitude, and so language is key, right? After all, I mean, it's workers, are the ones who vote in these national labor relations board elections, and oftentimes vote no. So, in Mississippi, what was it? They voted no 2,244 to 1,307 against representation. And we can see a similar loss in Volkswagen in 2014 in Chattanooga. So I want to talk about anti-unionism, the kind of the history of it, and kind of make some comments that I think are relevant for us today. So first, I think it's fair to say that anti-unionism is practically as old as capitalism itself. But we can really identify a considerable amount of employer-orchestrated union busting and strike-breaking in the years after the Civil War, right? This is a decade when we have public and private security forces, urban-based police departments, National Guardsmen, groups like the Pinkertons. They confronted strikes, they confronted union organizing campaigns, all right? Lots of bloody confrontations. Meanwhile, elites at this time formed various elite organizations, sometimes meeting in places like English-style gentlemen's clubs, and some of them formed elite militias. We have, in the 1880s, these kind of law and order leagues that emerge in a number of Midwestern cities. And in the South, we have, a number of elites forming in the 1860s and 70s, the Klan. And I want to argue that the Klan, the first Klan, in many ways served as kind of a pre-industrial employers association, forcing former slaves back onto farms and plantations. In the Midwest, in the Mountain West, places like Montana and Wyoming, elites formed various anti-rustler organizations and stock owners associations. And some of the folks at the very top of society, the captains of industry, the robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Jay Gould, they often justified their power and privilege by invoking Herbert Spencer's theory of survival of the fittest. Maybe you folks have heard of this idea. The idea is that, hey, look, we're the best, and you folks who are not here are losers, essentially. It's a real crass kind of thing. And so I think it's fair to say that we have these confrontations, we have these folks at the top of society, not very good in the area of public relations. Jay Gould, for example, the great railroad tycoon, was one of the most hated men in America in the late 19th century, busting railroad strikes. And this is a time when we have, muckraking journalists, middle-class reformers critiquing things like child labor, critiquing the long hours, critiquing the huge gap between rich and poor. And so when we think about the turn of the century, I think we can see some important developments. That is the progressive era, right? This idea that the early 20th century was a time of reform. And traditionally, scholars have said, hey, look, these employers, these folks who are active in union busting, they're real far-right people. But I want to argue that many of these folks really embraced the reformist spirit of the time, right? And they put forward these reformist ideas, including this idea of the open shop. Doesn't that sound nice? What sounds better? Open shop or closed shop, if you don't know any better? Open shop, right? So language really mattered at this time. And so we have organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers that they got smarter. And they realized that you need to have good public relations. People like Jay Gould, they're hated. These captains of industry, the so-called robber barons, they had terrible public relations. We fast forward into the turn of the century, the early 20th century, they're very susceptible. They want public legitimacy. And so they talked about solving what they called the labor problem. And the labor problem to them constituted things like strikes and boycotts and union organizing campaigns. And rather than talk about their own class interests as privileged people, as employers, they discussed the rights of individual workers to reject unionism. Right? And they embraced this kind of reformist language. They criticized monopolies. Some of them even criticized child labor. And they called unions, labor monopolies. They called it the labor trust. They talked about defending the rights of free workers, They formed organizations like citizens associations. That sounds pretty good, right? The Citizens Association. The most famous of which, or infamous, was the Citizens Industrial Association of America, which included on all its letterhead, quote, for the protection of the common people. They see themselves as protecting the common people. They called for these open shop workplaces. They disseminated their messages widely. They had deep pockets. And according to one source, the National Association of Manufacturers and its affiliate employers associations claim to have disseminated over 150 million pieces of literature between 1903 and 1906. Right? Deep pockets, they're spreading, they have newspaper owners, they're spreading this message that unions are bad, they're going to protect you, you don't have to be some slave to a union. Right? And so the open shop movement, designed to prevent the establishment of closed or union shops, was in many ways compatible in many ways with this progressive era. Right? And it's also, it was enormously popular. To give you a sense, this idea that employers should treat workers as individuals, not as collective bodies, was so popular that the New York Times noted in 1904 that, quote, the open shop is the first issue ever presented to employers upon which they could combine an entire agreement. Right? This is issued more than anything else. Anti-unionism united folks. So language was important. And we know that union activists often refer to this day as non-union members, as those who cross picket lines, as scabs. Right? Scabs is kind of an insulting term. But progressive era and their employers didn't necessarily like to use the term scab, although some did. Charles Eliot, who was the president of Harvard University and very close to a lot of these employers, called scabs heroes. And he wrote, these are heroes, they're justified, they get into all this trouble, we need to respect them, they risk their lives. And National Association of Manufacturers and other employers organizations would reprint this. Look at what Charles Eliot, this wonderful, higher ed administrator, calls them scabs, they're heroes, we need to support them. But the phrase that really catches on in a major way in the late 19th and early 20th century is this phrase that we hear today, the right to work. Right? The right to work. When did it first emerge? I first saw it used in 1866. That's a year after the Civil War, when striking workers are trying to prevent scabs from entering the workplace, and the employers are saying, give them the right to work. A little different from what it means today in the context of state laws regarding union security agreements and whatnot. But it really takes off in the progressive era. All these reformers used it, including liberal types. Theodore Roosevelt gave the square deal. That was the name of an agreement after this coal strike in 1902. And after that, we hear this phrase, right to work. The agreement, that coal strike, is explicit about give unions the right, but also give non-unions the right to work, right? Louis Brandeis, we often hear Louis Brandeis, great lawyer, progressive, was very much a supporter of the so-called non-union worker, the free worker, talked about the right to work quite a bit, and was actually a lawyer for a number of employers associations engaged in union busting. So what else do we see? We see at this time a number of AstroTurf organizations. You know, AstroTurf, this idea that it's like, you see these anti-union organizations and you assume, oh boy, it's just the people, they're just anti-union. Well, around 1903, we have the emergence of a group called the Independent Labor League of America, made up of former members of the International Association of Machinists in Elmira, New York. And these anti-union unions, sound weird, spread to Detroit and Albany, New York, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Muncie, Indiana, Sherman, Texas. And, they said, no, we're not doing the employers' dirty work. But the spokespersons were always employers, these sort of middle-class reformers. And they served as kind of a reserve force for employers seeking to break strikes and bust unions. And of course, some of you remember at Volkswagen during that Chattanooga strike, there was a group called the American Council of Employees. The idea is that this was a grassroots thing, and when you ask people, well, where's the funding come from? We're not going to talk about that. Right? So there's this sort of long tradition of these kind of AstroTurf organizations emerging, giving the sense that, hey, anti-unionism is this kind of thing from below, and in fact, it's really generated from above. It's also at this time, again, getting back to the early 20th century, that public relations alone wouldn't solve the so-called labor problem from the vantage point of employers. And many employers started giving benefits. We call this welfare capitalism. Maybe free turkeys at Christmas time, sports teams that would play one another, trips. And the idea here was to build what one anti-union activist called factory solidarity, not class solidarity. Factory solidarity, not class solidarity, right? You don't need an oppositional organization from below when we have benevolence from above. We're going to take care of you. So that was also part of this overall broad anti-union strategy. And of course, if we look at Nissan recently, there were some folks who said, hey, look, Nissan's the best thing that's happened in Mississippi in a lot of years. It's been life-changing. We don't need an outside entity to come in and tell us how to live, right? There were certainly folks who said, hey, look, our boss is taking care of us. We don't necessarily need it. Well, when economic crises hit, the first benefits to go oftentimes were these social benefits, these welfare capitalist benefits. So back to the 20th century, early 20th century. Anti-unionism was not simply a reformist phenomenon. We see a number of anti-union activists who were rather thuggish in how they behaved. A number of folks who were active in vigilante organizations from the late 19th century. The Ku Klux Klan, the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, the Montana Vigilantes. Some of these folks, we can trace these folks, they become active in anti-union organizations. Perhaps one of the most famous was a guy by the name of N.F. Thompson, who was one of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s. He had fought with Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, and served with him in the Klan. Fast forward 30 years, and he is one of the leaders of the anti-union movement, the open shop movement. He made waves, N.F. Thompson made waves in 1900. He's speaking at this this conference on solving the labor problem. And he called for a justifiable homicide law. Right? He made the front page of the New York Times. He said, hey, look, non-union workers, they should be able to shoot and kill strikers who prevent non-unionists from entering the workplace. And that was the front page of major newspapers, including the New York Times, in 1900. So here's a guy who's from the Klan, and fast forward, he's very active in anti-union struggles. He was in Alabama, then he was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he edited this, The Tradesman, this big this publication that attracted Southern businesses to the South. And basically says, hey, look, we don't have a labor problem here. There's only strikes in the North. Come on down, and you can invest here. We've got a great deal. The Tradesman, by the way, was owned by Adolph Ochs. He was the same owner as the New York Times, so we had these really prominent figures connected. So around the time of World War I, workers win some rights in the face of a tight labor market. Union membership increased. So for responsible union activists, things were okay. Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, supported the war, but of course radical unions faced a considerable amount of repression. Right? The IWW was forced underground. The Socialist Party didn't do so well. We can talk about the lynchings of Frank Little in Butte, Montana in 1917. But after the war, just as World War I's ending, employers are getting antsy. They don't like this idea. One guy says, to operate our mines and factories and compete in the world of trade, if we are to operate on a national 8-hour day and pay the wages which have been imposed during the stress of political opportunities, that we can't do this. And in 1919, what we see is a major strike wave. Hundreds of thousands of workers, longshoremen, coal miners, steel workers, shut down production, prompting employers to scramble for replacement workers while seeking help from police, judges, and scabs. And the words of one open shop advocate, a guy by the name of George Armstrong of Fort Worth, he says, there are but two possible outcomes of the contest: a Soviet government of industry in the country, or the open shop. And in the aftermath of this strike wave, we see what we might call the second wave open shop movement, where we have lots of organizing. We see a number of these employers' associations calling themselves American plans. They're invoking the flag, being very patriotic. In Dallas, we have the Southwest Open Shop Association, which said that they followed the Patriots under General Sam Houston, right? So we've got some regional patriotism. And by September of 1920, 1,665 separate employers and business associations throughout the country supported the open shop. This is very much in the mainstream. By 1923, the number of workers in unions stood at 3.5 million, a decline from a wartime high of 5 million. And so went down. But of course, in the 1930s, we can talk about employers facing a series of defeats. We have a resilient labor movement expressed most forcefully by the Committee of Industrial Organizations, later the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that is the CIO, led to the dramatic collapse of many open shops throughout much of the nation, forcing employers to regroup. We have strikes, mass picketing. We have a president, Roosevelt, who was somewhat pro-labor. We have a number of state developments, the Wagner Act being the most famous, that encourage collective bargaining. But I think it's important to point out that employers, including managers of cotton pickers in California to textile mill owners in New England to regions of the South, often ignored state authorities tasked with the job of encouraging collective bargaining. Workers still had to fight in the 1930s. The open shop philosophy remained powerful. And these employers continue to talk about protecting the people, not their own narrow interests as a class, as employers. And they set up citizens committees, they formed alliances with municipal authorities, they paid large sums for public relations purposes, hundreds of thousands of dollars in newspaper advertisements, and organizing back-to-work movements during these great strikes in the 1930s. And it seemed that they're getting away with it, and that the federal government's commitment to organized labor seemed tepid at best. Refusing to accept the Wagner Act's encouragement of collective bargaining, many managers just would collaborate with police forces who periodically beat and shot strikers. Most famously or infamously On Memorial Day in 1937, Chicago policemen fatally shot 10 strikers. Roosevelt, a supposed friend of labor, responded coldly, a plague on both your houses. My point is simple, that employers remain very powerful despite changes to labor law. They didn't like any interference, whether from labor or from the liberal state. And again, we see regrouping. And the South, I think the South becomes very important. We have a new organization in the 1930s called the Southern States Industrial Council, right? Which forms to maintain a North-South differential. The same thing that Thompson did. Send a message to employers, hey, you can come here. We don't have these labor problems. Others made explicitly racist appeals. Have folks heard of this guy, Vance Muse? A guy by the name of Vance Muse, right? Who was a former union member, actually, who participated in a strike at the Swift Company in 1907 in Fort Worth. But he had become a big, an organizer of a group called the Christian Americans. Talk about AstroTurf, right? You know, he's funded by all these big companies. He calls himself the Christian Americans. And they were formed in 1936. And again, the idea is to draw attention from the class interest to, you know, something else, Christianity, Americanism, whatever. And so he warned, Vance Muse warned that the CIO, that very inclusive union, threatened to further unite workers across racial lines, and quote, white women and white men will be forced into organizations with black African apes, whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs. Right? So appealing to that explicit kind of racism was critical for the anti-union movement led by people like Muse. And so they continued, anti-union forces continued to criticize collective bargaining. And in 1941, right here in Dallas, maybe you folks know, the Dallas Morning News columnist William Ruggles published an essay calling for a constitutional amendment protecting the non-unionist right to work, which would essentially abolish closed shops. Vance Muse hears about that and campaigns for anti-union right-to-work laws in nearby Arkansas, which ultimately passes an a right-to-work law in 1944. And then, of course, we have Momentum is against organized labor. 1947, we have the Taft-Hartley Act, named after Ohio Senator Robert Taft and New Jersey Congressman Fred Hartley, a pro-business modification of the Wagner Act that was pushed aggressively by business organizations, called for a ban on sympathy strikes, declared that employers have a right to dissuade workers from joining unions, demanded that union leaders sign statements promising they were not communists, prohibited foremen from collective bargaining activities, banned closed shops, and gave further legitimacy to right-to-work laws. And so I think the employer free speech part is relevant. At Nissan, employers held countless numbers of meetings designed to scare the workers and to ensure that they did not support the campaign. Following this, we have in 1955 the formation of the National Right to Work Committee, an employer-led organization masquerading as a cross-class group committed to fighting the union bosses and compulsory unionism. This was led partly by Fred Hartley, and they lobbied politicians, published and disseminated newsletters, organized public speaking events, and produced and distributed anti-union films, offered legal assistance to anti-union workers. And the messages were generally these kind of recycled talking points from the progressive era, and were often effective. And there were other groups that participated, old groups like the National Association of Manufacturers was still critical, Chamber of Commerce, Southern Tariff Association, and so they had right to work was on the ballot in a number of states in 1958. And what's interesting is that organized labor was able to mobilize its forces and defeat right to work initiatives in most states: California, Colorado, Idaho, Ohio, and Washington. Only Kansas was the only state where voters supported this right to work. And in 1978, pro-union activists in Missouri defeated a proposal to become a right to work state. So this, of course, what we have now is more, we have 28 right to work states today. And so this kind of gets to the present, kind of finishing up here. The present, the economy looks a bit different. We've got globalization, the rise of the right, a very unapologetic anti-union right wing. The unwillingness of mainstream Democrats to really champion the labor movement, and above all, employers' uncompromising anti-unionism. These, I think, are the primary forces that have led to decline in union density. The infrequency of strikes, a general lack of knowledge about unions themselves, which I think is also an important problem. Organized employers have both attacked labor as well as labor studies centers, the places that might teach us about what the labor union does. Right-wing foundations have attacked these centers in numerous states, and plenty of academics, a lot of mainstream liberals are, indifferent about labor, frankly. And so the history that I've outlined, I think, helps in some ways kind of make sense of the defeat at Nissan. Not perfectly. I mean, Nissan, the workforce was majority black, and black workers have historically been the most inclined to join unions and participate in labor. We don't have a modern N.F. Thompson or Vance Muse seeking to dissuade workers, but what we do have is fear, right? I think the conditions are a little different there. The fear that the plant will shut down, that the union only cares about dues. We have this appeal to team, like the old welfare capitalists. One of the slogans they had was "Our team, our future." But racism wasn't entirely missing. One black worker, according to the New York Times, claimed that the white supervisors rewarded white workers who were their friends with cushier assignments. You've got Billy Bob as your manager. You go duck hunting, possum hunting together. So, racism remained, but I doubt it was the chief reason for the failure, again, as a majority black workforce. The plant paid some of the best wages in the region. We're not talking about southern textile mills, which paid poverty wages. Having said that, this is not to deny the exploitative reality of the work. It was dangerous. Managers would behave like dictators, etc. And I also think we shouldn't be afraid to criticize the union organizing campaign in that case either. From what I have read, they didn't establish a strong enough culture of unionism within the community, left out temp workers, that kind of thing, didn't have a strong group going into it. And of course, one should always anticipate this kind of incredible anti-union propaganda going into any campaign. So I think we need to have more conversations, kind of wrapping up about workplaces, the nature of exploitation, the history of labor management relations. I think we really need to understand these people, their interests, stop using the passive voice. I think we need to build unity with one another, of course, and going forward, we need to have education about management's nefarious activities. Solidarity, absolutely critical, of course, and so, this history is not told as much, I think, and I think we need to know more about it. So, thank you for listening. I'll end it there. I'm happy to entertain questions and disagreements.